Thank you very much. And it's an honor to be invited to speak. So I'm afraid I didn't prepare any sort of PowerPoint, but I wrote a paper and I'm going to read it now. In the Mirror Darkly, the condition of being determining consciousness and the limitations of envisioning a utopian becoming from the vantage point of the present. Hi, I want to thank the organizers of the speaker series for seeking me out and inviting me to this discussion. For my master's thesis, as Sophie mentioned, which I finished in 2021, I wrote a 300-page paper or so on the socialist calculation debate and reflected on many subsequent socialist utopian visions, with an eye towards the economic context of their development. Since I was thinking, like the organizers are, in terms of a practical utopianism, I appreciate being given a platform to discuss my ideas, even though I am not currently engaged in an academic context. When I wrote my thesis, I was coming from the context of being a longtime, relatively read movementist, ecologically minded anarchist. This milieu led me to a pursuit of utopian socialism in the first place, and has caused me, upon deeper reflection, to expand my criticisms of these utopian approaches. As such, not only for their specific concrete lack of viability, but also for the main fact that these values, which are being imposed, which animate each time period of utopian theorizing, already reflect the existing changes and dynamics which animate the economy the theorist is living in, or at least ones that have a deep proximity to their contemporary reality. I now find that the models integrate and reflect more from their historical and contemporary economic context than I previously realized. And therefore, their applicability to problems of the future are likely even more limited, though not completely absent. Like all science fiction, the concrete technology might reflect the future, but the social dynamics and categories often reflect the present or the past. The present or the past. I admit to reaching a bit of an Adornian impasse with these ideal forms, which I am not sure how to envision my way out of at this point. I suppose I came upon leftist politics in the 90s and aughts with uh, that was disenchanted with the previous trajectory of the Marxist project, viewed as irrevocably, apologies, Stalinist. But the attitude of pure negation and alternate aesthetics did not lead us intellectually to better alternatives. Many social theorists pointed to real social problems and made useful observations, but when it came to identifying solutions, the theory was much more thin and speculative. Often theorists tend to propose aesthetic prescriptions, as in a reintroduction of or ramping up of forms from the past, ignoring their internal problems, since they seem to address certain deficiencies in the current system. I found these solutions were not well thought out in general, since their consequences and premises were not examined at the most superficial, they were only examined at the most superficial ideal level. In my thesis, I was attempting to take these solutions seriously and examine their history and the degree to which they could be employed to develop future prospects. The anti-globalization tendency of this time period, no matter the discursive framing, was leaning more to the right than to the left if we took its logical, more localist, isolationist conclusions seriously. I feel it has taken me a while to significantly disconnect my thinking from this memeified sloganistic discourse of this time period and its discursive truisms in place of sincere political economic analysis and practically well understood political strategy. I find that the tendencies of existential, postmodern, and anarchistic forms have mainly involved a regression to previously failed approaches, at the same time as dismissing historical comparison or analogy in terms of economic dynamics, rather than an imagined eternalized ontological affinity stemming from an imagined common Dasein. The explanation for failure generally emphasizes conspiratorial betrayal of outsiders or those who should have been treated as enemies, in contrast to the pure altruistic good people who have always had the correct programs in their hearts. That is, the solution to previous failure is fundamentally Schmittian and right-wing in its appeal to ontological difference, to explain the failure of solidarity, which reifies this difference zoologically. We could contrast this to actually explaining what these tendencies might occur in a non-centralizing way, recognizing how these relate to the economy and to the limitations of the differential leverage of particular approaches. I think that we must understand these dynamics better to actually take steps to constructively move forward, rather than positing fundamentally irreconcilable and mutually exclusive ontological absences. This can encourage a self-fulfilling prophecy into the future, even as dynamics change. My presentation today is focused on the question, how does our consciousness derived from our moment go beyond itself without merely reflecting what already exists in ideal form? I don't have an answer to this question exactly, but I think it's something we need to take seriously, to consider if our aims to create if our aims are seriously to create a better future. In seeing the consciousness of socialists as embedded in contradictions which are being confronted in present day society in a more dialectical rather than essentialist transhistorical terms, we can see that these socialists are situated in the contradictions of their day and may not be able to see beyond them. Insofar as their vision is resonant, it embodies popular consciousness, which is a reflection of existing relations. This consciousness attempts to reflect temporary resolutions to emergent economic crises, which have utility in a limited and contingent fashion towards the totality of economic relations. What often lies behind the approach of utopian socialists is the attempt to solve for the universal, which is encountered and has come into crisis in the moment, without understanding that even the resolution to the particular conflict also generates new problems or contradictions which are difficult to foresee in advance. Often, in fact, in the midst of the resolution, due to the idealist historical approach to the perspective of the utopian, they cannot identify the resolution as it emerges. Often, their resolution is to a moment that has already passed and acts in the present. As Hegel stated in his Philosophia Right, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling dusk. That is, we cannot identify the change clearly as it emerges, but only in retrospect. Marx said in his work, A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, it is their social being that determines their consciousness. That is, utopian ideas, rather than presaging the future, more resemble the ideals which reflect the present and the past. The present ideals represent economic arrangements which already exist, which are coming into being, rather than something we can project as future potential per se. This presents a big problem for utopians who are attempting to solve contemporary problems in terms of the present context, motivated by the moral impulse that legitimates it. After studying much of the history of utopian socialist ideas and their critiques, I've come back to the premise of Marx, rather than reflecting future prospects. These ideas reflect contemporary consciousness. As Marx suggests, these values idealize, refract back onto the economy, making it into an impossible system. Often the solutions to the problems suggested already exist in ways that are superior to the idealized versions, but these are ignored since they don't conform to aesthetic commitments of the theorists. My presentation today will focus on the problems with projecting the morality and social understanding of the past and contemporary society into the development of a utopian future. Although I did not center this problem in my master's thesis, I noted how different contexts of thought, particularly the social crises that were prominent at the time of the authors of the utopian theories or progressive theory wrote, conditioned and shaped their theory. But I did not examine the implications of this more deeply. That is what I wish to do here. As Marx said in a footnote in Capital Volume 1, Proudhon begins by taking his ideal of justice eternelle, from the juridical relations that correspond to the production of commodities. Thereby, it may be noted, he proves to the consolation of all good citizens that the production of commodities is a form of production as everlasting as justice. Then he turns round to seek to reform the actual production of commodities and the actual legal system corresponding thereto in accordance with this ideal. What opinion should we have of a chemist who, instead of studying the actual laws of the molecular changes in the composition and decomposition of matter on the foundation solving definite problems, claim to regulate the composition and decomposition of matter by means of eternal ideas of naturalite and athenite? Do we really know any more about usury when we say it contradicts eternal justice, etiquette eternale, mutualité eternale, or other vérité eternale than the fathers of the church did when they said it was incompatible with grace eternale, foi eternale, and la vente eternale, bonté eternale, excuse my French, de deux. Marx critiqued Proudhon's prescription for attempting to solve for the economy of the future with a prescriptive abstraction that animates the relations of the present, but in a way that cannot possibly function, since it inverts the order of operations towards the juridical, in contrast to the interplay of power dynamics in relation to the production process, which are emergent rather than planned out in advance in ontological terms. These are decided through real political economic leverage rather than pure diktat based on legal principle encoded culturally. The law codifies power, but it is not its origin. This is the central mistake of idealists, since they think that if they change the rules that society will conform. This might appear correct, since laws on the balance are an accommodation to the changing basis of power, but they are not its source. Those who pass laws may not notice this, but the power structures that maintain them are the source of their legitimacy and power. Marx states again from the Poverty of Philosophy, instead of saying, like everyone else, when the weather is fine, a lot of people are seen going out for a walk, and Proudhon makes his people go out for a walk in order to be able to ensure fine weather. This quote illustrates the problem with attempting to address economic dynamics with purely structuring ideological prescriptions through legislation, rather than understanding how complex human interactions produce particular structures and behaviors descriptively, which is in no way static, determined or fixed by nature. There's an attempt to legislate the solution in the abstract without considering the forces required to maintain the structure. People are not just automatons fulfilling a prescribed role, a prescribed form by pure rote obedience from absolute rulers. Even in the context of rulers who imagine the structure they imposed is based on their absolute power. Rather, the social form is produced by the conflict of different interests about the social reproduction of life as a cooperative, increasingly socialized project, as in that which is reproduced by broader society rather than through relatively isolated processes. People are drawn to particular projects for particular historical and socially contingent reasons, and they are drawn out of them due to the same set of motivations and interests in a statistical, not a universal rate. In his critique of the Proudhon's work in the Poverty Philosophy, in the paper of Philosophy of Poverty, he shows that Proudhon's utopian approach appears to be taking the economic values derived from Smith and Ricardo, and likely a good deal of Proudhon's personal experience in the world. He argues that Proudhon reflects the values he derives from the capitalist economy back onto an ideal economy, which is animated by these values in a way that could not possibly function in the real world. This economy assumes that the actions of economic agents can just be legislated into existence from the outside, from outside of their own will and self-interest, so as to conform with an ideal of justice. For instance, Proudhon suggests that workers, by which he imagines primarily independent artisans, would be compensated through a people's bank for the exact concrete number of labor hours they spend on constructing a particular good. This approach is congruent with the capitalist ethic as derived from the system of capitalist social relations, that the worker should be paid per hour based on their efforts. However, the economy, in context of a low degree of monopoly, pays the owner of manufactured goods on the basis of an average socially necessary labor time of the production process, since this is the necessary cost beyond any markup. If a producer takes longer than the necessary market rate, and the goods are seen by the customers as relatively equivalent, and therefore not niche or luxury items, then they will be paid below their actual hourly rate, likely leading to a decline in their business venture. The result is that surviving businesses pay their workers at a rate based on the socially necessary labor time. Although the employer may lengthen the working day to increase the rate of exploitation, this is not a substantial difference between businesses, but in the economy overall. The perverse process of attempting to correct the market by adjusting price to individual concrete hours rather than the average necessary hours means that goods produced through potentially less skilled and less developed production processes will cost more for consumers than those produced by more highly skilled producers who use better equipment. We must ask then, why would any consumers voluntarily buy these items if there are worse quality goods, which are more expensive? One can see from this example that the moral impulse derived from the social relations of capitalist society reflect back on it is not an adequate basis for constructing a better economic structure or reforming the existing. It merely seems to represent a utopian idea that animates and justifies the system itself, which is the outcome of the system itself. It purports to challenge the system, but its vision for the future is just an obscured and idealized present. I think this return of utopianism in a way reflects paradoxically an emphasis of conserving being as it is imagined over the expanded possibilities and potential expansion of freedom in becoming. Proudhon, in his justice-based utopianism, was trying to preserve independent craft labor, artisan labor, in relation to a more competitive wage labor within an expanded mutualist market system. He's not wrong that producing the whole good yourself, or at least most of it, and selling it reduces alienation and can feel like good, honest work, in contrast to more alienated and atomized wage labor. But this mode of such limited cooperation is just not compatible with broader human flourishing or equality. It is not that previous forms just go away absolutely. Artisan labor still exists. Rather, it becomes mainly a mode for marginal luxury goods, which become less affordable for the majority of the population. His vision of the future said more about his attempt to conserve the past as it confronts the present than what the future could actually be. An alternative to this might be to extrapolate on the consequences of existing trends. But the limitation of this is that often theorists have no basis to anticipate counter tendencies which limit the trend. It is also unclear if the trend is relatively an anomaly in the social structure. Particular trends should not be assumed to extend in an increasing rate into the future necessarily. In this regard, I'm referring to the structure of war and economic crisis. Although these do shape the structure of the economy on a long-term basis, it does not follow that these economic structures do not return to some sense of normalcy, even as certain changes persist. That is, historical change should not be viewed merely as a linear progressive form, but a dialectic based on converging and diverging interests of economic actors in society on the basis of their leverage over economic structures rather than purely enlightened ideals. The issue of the imposition of contemporary values extracted from the emerging economic structure into a utopian future was a problem for the utopian forms I studied in my thesis. This was a particularly prominent issue for those theorizing in the neoliberal era. For example, the neoliberal impulse to diversify production lines to meet different values, identities, and lifestyles was already expanding this period due to the reduced cost for factories to produce different shorter run production lines rather than just maintain more seasonal homogeneous production. This allowed the industrial system to adapt to greater product diversity, appealing to individualism emerging out of the 70s, which rejected the post-war shell-shocked conformity of their parents. The white picket fence conformist fantasies seem to be disconnected from the primary reason these escapist tendencies existed, being the popular wish to retreat into fantasy, a fantasy of stability to escape war trauma in restored peaceful order as a refuge. When depending on the next generation, companies were panicked at low rates of consumer demand for traditional industries of the time, so they were highly motivated to adapt products to meet the desires of a new generation of consumers. We are now familiar with the constant and pathetic cries of established industries of every subsequent generation that the current generation is killing this or that industry. They invented values and lifestyles marketing to solve this issue. This is outlined quite well in Adam Curtis's famous docuseries in the third part of the Century of Self. I would add that the decline of the purchasing power of those in the industrial economy in this period and the rising unemployment due to offshoring and technological innovations meant that producers could make more by catering to niche markets of the middle classes rather than producing more cheap utilitarian products for the masses. Hence, the trend for higher cost product diversity. The participatory tendency found in various utopian theorists such as Diane Ellison, Devine and Adaman, as well as Albert and Hanel, came out of the same frustration with the degenerating post-war Fordism and the neoliberal tendency in the 1970s and 80s, which produced the right-wing public choice theory. There was a sense that the problems with production and governments were primarily a principal agent problem, which took an often conspiratorial tone due to monopoly power of bureaucrats in cushy jobs and senses of social conformity. As the bargaining power of the Western worker declined and international production competition rebounded, so there was less surplus to distribute socially. That is the same critique. This is the same critique of the Thatcherite and Reaganite politics. These theorists indicated that diversity of production lines could be achieved democratically. However, it is unclear how amalgamating diverse and potentially contradictory desires for project elements of non-experts in a democratic structure into a design of production schematics could possibly be effective. This is because the qualities of any particular item must be balanced pragmatically based on what is possible due to physical limitations of materials, what is technologically feasible to accomplish, and what is also cost effective. There is no reason that a capitalist institution, for instance, based on structural competitive motivations would not already be motivated to solve this problem. That is, if the purchasing power of the demographic market is sufficient to economically justify the risks of producing it. The solution to this problem already exists with focus groups, surveys, and consumer product testing. If a democratic council of consumers would give them more market share, they would assemble it to beat their competitors. Although they did not appeal to non-experts in the design process, they deploy resources to determine consumer input into what they would like to purchase. Although during a previous phase, capital based on the capacity of the industrial system and both the social conformity and corporatist planning structure of the war and post-war economy, there was little product diversity to suit consumers in capitalist economies. We imagine greater consumer determination of product lines as a leftist program in contemporary terms, since it attempts to aggregate and provide popular preferences. But this was employed as the ideology of the far right of liberalism at the time. It is also reflected as a broader anti-conformist, anti-bureaucratic tendency, which seems to be satiated through more targeted production lines to sub-demographics, made possible through increased ease of retooling. as exemplified in, again, I mentioned the turn to values and lifestyles marketing, away from purely homogeneous trends, seasonal trends. Although the Democratic Council in production would be most structurally unfeasible due to the lack of specific expertise, which is generally distributed, they would find the greatest utility in focus group survey research to satiate these target demographics. These methods were not new in theory in the 70s and 80s, but the retooling of production lines was, so they could more effectively deploy target micro niches. There was an activist sense that the markets were being addressed that previously were not, as if this was a mere political development from a sense of aesthetic and target demographic fixity, not capitalism, targeting demographics which previously had less disposable income and now had more. It represents relatively greater integration of more nominally excluded groups into the middle classes. Of course, the majority of these groups were not addressed in this production targeting, since it mainly addresses upwardly mobile representatives rather than the populations overall. The situation was even worse in the state communist countries. However, the lack of product diversity is not the central problem with capitalism that socialism must solve. This phenomenon merely reflects particular phases of and dynamics between industrial capacity and political structure. The socialist utopian models merely extract this sentiment from the zeitgeist at the time when the capitalist economy has already addressed this problem, and the communist economy is trying to do the same with the Khrushchevite reforms, which attempt to shift more production capacity to consumer goods. Maybe the sentiment was more directed towards the homogeneity of production lines in the communist context, where the production of consumer goods was more limited. However, this problem was mostly due to a particular form of strategic production trajectories in less developed economies, as well as an attempt to invest more in the means of production, infrastructure, and the military, coming out of a similar war context. But societies with a lower degree of industrial capacity, that is, this was not an outcome of the lack of planning. It was a result of strategic planning. Since these economies were attempting to catch up to the more developed West, they generally invested less in the consumer sector, so as to raise the standard of living into the future at the cost of the living standards of the present. This was the major reason that there were insufficient stocks of goods available for purchase, and consumers had more money than there were supplies of goods. Hence, the reputation of and necessity to line up to get goods while they were available. They deployed the logic of popular social investment in the future economy through enthusiasm for this kind of policy, though this enthusiasm for this kind of policy declined with time after the revolution, due to the decline of personal affinity with the project. However, I do not think that if these countries tried to have democratic councils to determine what to produce ex ante, that this would solve the problem. Product surveys in advance of production, focus groups, and beta testing would suffice to achieve this target and are much easier than using a democratic council, and it would produce much more coherent results. The problem was more the lack of production capacity more generally, which strategically deprioritized the consumer sector to produce a wealthier society in the future. It's just as important, or it's important to understand that the consequence of the developmental state strategy is to make a choice about what to prioritize as a matter of policy. This is also at play in the war economy for different reasons, though similar. This obviously means that some things will be neglected in relation to a more industrially developed economic vanguard context, which has more overall capacity. However, this is not a structural flaw in this kind of system, even if the populace turn to black market goods to better satisfy their needs, since the formal economy wouldn't do it. Although there was a conformist ideology in these contexts, if demand could have been more effectively met by merely changing around what was produced satisfy their citizenry, they would have done so with the methods I mentioned, which were already in use in the 1920s. There was no structural or ideological problems with either capitalist or socialist economies to incorporating these techniques to better appeal to consumers. The social conformity in production lines was likely a product of the total mobilization of the war effort and the capacity of large factories rather than something in the ideology of the production priorities themselves. Overall, in this incorporation of popular sentiment into the economic theoretical problem misunderstands the source of the problem, so it attributes it to merely an issue of policy. Often these systems also attempt to reinvigorate and put a progressive spin on failed and marginal economic strategies which meet some discursive and aesthetic goals, but are almost always necessarily disasters. For instance, many of the new models suggest a moral reward system, social esteem for a job well done, rather than emphasizing expanding purchasing power for workers who accomplish good work to disincentivize consumerism. This is frankly the same logic of the pizza party in the capitalist workplace in lieu of bonuses for extra effort, which is felt justifiably as insulting to workers. In the early communist context, the Stakhanovite movement adopted similar things by motivating workers to surpass their targets and have friendly competition with their coworkers for esteem with enthusiasm for moral reward. With sympathy, I can see this as somewhat motivating in proximity to the revolution, where people can feel like they are building the new society. However, I experienced the worst kind of this technique in my youth with door-to-door pure commission sales-based jobs, which tried to incentivize us to outcompete our coworkers with such prizes as winning the right to ring a bell or a gong at the end of day meeting. The mandating of workers to do chants and cheers for the company to increase enthusiasm also taps into this impulse. I generally found this to be profoundly insulting to my intelligence, even in my relative youth. The anti-consumerist tendency also reflects the decline of purchasing power for most workers, where they are encouraged by their betters to morally acclimatize themselves to this context, telling them they actually ought to have less, but for moral reasons due to overconsumption. Capitalism is not against paying workers less ideologically, as if particular businesses need their workers to be bigger consumers, so they pay them more on purpose. They will do whatever they can to pay their workers less, and if moral awards can seem to be a replacement for real compensation, then they will try it. I will say that the strategy in general is often very limited in its efficacy, which cannot really expand. I personally would not want it to expand. Comment on dialectic. I do believe that there are distinct conservative and liberal ideological responses to crisis, which attempt to resolve particular material antinomies. These manifest in particular moral forms, which we should interrogate. The conservative response tends to be the romantic one, to return to a previous mode of organization, which was imagined to be more stable and natural, as the reason for the shift was a mere lapsarian adventurist error, not a concrete development. The latter is never an absolute solution, but presents its own obstacles and problems. The liberal is often to affirm what is emergent in the moment. The problem with this is that often it is that what can be emergent is not as progressive as it seems and can mask the expanding illiberalism, which is really manifesting in a period of relative or local decline. The new norms which emerge from a moment of regression seek moral justification in the moment, but are not progressive on the whole. Just because these are elements of illiberalism emerging from liberalism does not mean that these do not represent some broader global progressivism, however abstracted in the process. I think the relative decline of bargaining power of labor in the neoliberal period for the majority of society is masked behind ideologies of inclusion, which are tokenistic, not democratic, and an increased emphasis on mental hygiene through therapy for those who are struggling to cope with the crisis. New developments can also be elaborate scams, like the recent crypto debacle, but we can find many liberals trying to justify it in progressive and liberatory terms. The future is developed to some degree through a guess and test method, though there are more and less educated or wise guesses. We are now more at a point of confusion where we mix up liberal and illiberal positions based on particularity and think that we have and I think we have lost our vision or refuse to see what is happening because many of us justifiably don't like the way it looks. Beyond the hope of an emergent democratic impulse, which one might anticipate from the expanding economic leverage of the global working class, mobilized for popular common interests, I don't have much faith in purely legislative or voluntary models transcending the real leverage of actors in relation to economic enterprises. The disciplining factor of interconnected systems change people in ways that are not chosen by them. They shape these people on the whole into what is required to maintain and reproduce the system. If agents don't fulfill their expected roles, they will be replaced by those who do. There's also a possibility of systems not adapting and failing, which can represent a general decline in social function. This is the core of the impulse of the slogan, socialism or barbarism, since failure to deal with a crisis correctly is always a possibility. Agency of individuals and small groups in terms of impacting these large systems and dynamics is extremely narrow, since we no longer have a system of rulership of personalities on the basis of birthright, as imbued in the personal outlook, ideology, and will. The legitimacy of roles rests in the agent's ability to perform their role within the system, all corruption aside. Corruption cannot be the basis of governance, or would not be understood as an aberration. The limitations of political voluntarism. I want to touch on the limitations of political voluntarism briefly. As utopian models for socialism, among others, among other similar political tendencies, suggest to some degree that the main obstacle to achieving an ideal society is designing the correct transhistoric model and convincing enough people to voluntarily adopt this as their mode of relating to each other. The purely voluntarist approach assumes that the ideology dominating the moment is just a collective illusion, which we can simply wake people out of through an ideological corrective, which in turn can just change our social relations irrespective of material conditions. As many have learned more recently, where the right is yelling, where the right, not the left, is yelling, wake up sheeple at people and attempting to seize the state to enact its vision, merely by force is not effective for them either. What is not understood is that the ideology of the moment is more a narrative justification of existing dynamics in moral form, and so are the progressive counter movements, constructing new ideologies to better assert emerging conditions. Changing ideologies doesn't change conditions, but it does reflect changing conditions. Regressive romantic visions exist as well in society. We all know them. These imagine some past ideal state, which some rebellious, authentic, anti-hegemonic, or even anti-capitalist, but ultimately in a regressive way. This is explored well in the works of Moshe Postone, particularly in his examinations of anti-Semitism and in his essay, History and Helplessness. It's also examined quite well in Georg Lukács' book, The Destruction of Reason. In these romantic visions, society was formerly more healthy, just, and natural. These romantics imagined that we have just fallen from this natural equilibrium and now must return to this ideal state that some foreign corrupting agent has broken us out of. It should be noted that implementing these kinds of visions are generally disastrous, even more unserious than the utopian visions, since their concretizing interventions cannot work in the way they imagine. It is not that they are impossible, it's just that they usually worsen the problems they intend to solve, since they have incorrectly understood what they stem from. No political category is exempt from these tendencies towards either universalism or particularism. The historical structural economic forms and their context, and the context of their relevance. In the conclusion to my thesis, I suggested that approximate systems reflecting broad structural forms which may have a resemblance to many of the utopian systems I studied and which are of interest to you, could be of relevance to future economic contexts and certainly certain likely trends. However, I have come to realize that these were more reflective of their moment, in the mirror darkly, than of potential futures. It's not that the ideas and sentiments expressed historically in these theories won't mirror aspects that have application to future dynamics. It's just that these will only be clear in retrospect. They mainly reflect the future in ways that past conditions reflect future ones. The concrete prescriptions are often bad and ill-conceived, but often are responding and reflecting in an obscured way, as I will describe in more detail, is real and needs to be necessarily considered. The Austrian neoliberal theorists like Hayek relied on the universalization of the relatively autonomous, atomized liberal agent. They imagined these agents to be more free in their decision-making and disconnected from the advantages of combination, like a self-sufficient yeoman farmer agent. These theories had the most significant application 50 years after they were written, conforming to a context where labor was in decline. Other imagined social systems might gain relevance in the future in a similar way that is analogous to past conditions, only because elements of the economic dynamics of the past have returned, though not in totality. History does have a somewhat cyclical character, as modified by a dialectic, so as not to be merely analogistically seasonal, but similar problems can arise in a somewhat cyclical manner, which allow reflections from a previous moment to gain new purchase. However, these don't use most of what is contained in their premises ideologically as prescribed, but mirror similar dynamics which might require similar solutions. Neoliberalism is not a conspiracy of bad academics and politicians. It reflects real power dynamics internationally that have to be dealt with in a real way that cannot be wished away through nostalgia. I imagine the Cockshott and Cottrell model would appear later than the others in my conclusion, since it required a larger civil sector, since public monopoly would be more advanced. However, I should have thought about the dynamics of both the war economy and catch-up development more historically, where the role for state monopoly is relatively greater as a pre-capitalist administrative state, and this declines when this method is more exhaustive. Despite rhetoric about slashing the state by centrist right parties, slashing tends to be manifest as a reprioritization of funding within the state rather than a shrinking of the state. Additionally, the common understanding that shrinking the state is achieved through the reduction in taxes is not true in the modern economy with currency sovereignty, as articulated descriptively by modern monetary theory. Taxes merely allow the state to reallocate portions of the surplus along with direct program funding. The relative domain of public administration only seems to expand in the longer term, even expanding beyond its territory so as to police markets internationally. All this to say that the economic mode that relies on more administrative calculation and top-down or even popular democratic central strategy can both precede and proceed other democratic forms. This depends on its relation to other states in terms of its relative economic development. Key economic moments which are reflected in utopian forms. In this presentation, I will outline a few large-scale economic structural dynamics which shape our visions of ourselves and our moral commitments, which have been relevant in the 20th century and into the 21st. These shape our utopian visions of the future in terms that are mainly relevant to the present and tend not to persist. The central ones seem to be the large-scale war economy of the 20th century, the developmental state, and neoliberal globalization, or what I think of as the global developmental state. Utopian visions over this time period integrate these mainly in sequence, though not totally, since what appears more relevant at the time is resonant to potential audiences, speaking more to their particular moment. The problem is often what is of priority and emergent in these moments is not relevant outside of them. So it is limited to what degree these can be of relevance into the future. I once heard a Buddhist parable about a person building a raft across a river and the predicament of that person not knowing whether to bring the raft along with them after crossing the river. Dragging the raft behind as the person continues on their journey seems appealing, since it allows the person to overcome this previous obstacle. It did correctly help them to achieve a goal. However, since it requires so much extra effort, it is obviously impractical. This reflects our predicament regarding our D-list models. Just because a particular form or strategy was useful in a particular context to overcome a particular obstacle does not mean that it is desirable to incorporate it permanently going forward. This does not mean that models are not useful to approach similar problems. Historical trajectories regarding a ramp up in industrialization have a good deal of consistency historically since they are encountering similar problems. However, in an economy that has already become somewhat modern and industrialized, the mere repetition of this historical process cannot necessarily overcome this new obstacle. The raft is used in overcoming one obstacle. It is not necessarily in overcoming a different one. I would contend that our problem in studying the socialist calculation debate has been in determining what is really at stake and the changing context of the relevancy of the administrative allocation, calculation, and planning in relation to changing economic structures and the concrete demands which shape them. In the initial socialist calculation debate, the neoclassical socialists like Lang and Taylor appeared to make a fairly strong case in relation to the Austrians. Their model provided seemingly useful conclusions because of the context of the underdeveloped state and the possibility of using already developed and efficient production methods, which they could impose and optimize through planning where available. It is only in retrospect of neoliberalism that the Austrians appear to have won the debate all along, even though this was not the previous consensus. There is some evidence to suggest that wartime economic planning and catch-up development are useful and effective in certain contexts up to a certain point. Recall my raft metaphor. Beyond this, new solutions have to be introduced to overcome these. Certainly, Keynesian counter-cyclical planning remains useful to more developed capitalist economies, but mainly as a method to manage crises and anticipate them. The relevant questions of economic context and the problems that need to be solved are more pertinent than the feasibility of a particular program infinitely into the future as a model. In a sense, the particular was confused for the universal in relation to the shape of the existing national economy. Austrians were correct about the problem of generating new methods of production and deciding between production methods using some sort of objective validation ex post, which are not found in objective data, to be used ex ante as if there is a source for this, but determined through capitalist social relations. That is, the administrative prices obscured the determination of cost efficiency. What is required to innovate economically is to determine new methods of production with a lower amount of socially necessary labor time in relation to the rest of the system, which produces an item of at least equivalent quality. This requires prices in some sense of their cost of reproduction. While the giant matrix calculation method is useful for calculating an efficient balance of already existing methods for particular targeted ends in correct proportion, it is not useful to innovate new methods of production which could be more efficient socially. That is, a matrix calculation can optimally balance given resources, but which have predetermined priority, but cannot tell you anything about the increase in use values that are possible using different production methods that allow for more socially optimal goals. Without agents within the system having some motivated reason to make more with less, and having some method for determining what that is exactly, there is little one can imagine people can do with the opportunities arising from the social use of waste products or the unplanned surpluses of intermediate goods. These problems became more significant later in the 20th century for developing economies that had already exhausted the potential of state-directed industrialization, using methods given from the outside. As the economy developed, it became more and more difficult to import and impose methods already developed elsewhere through relatively competitive, though never absolutely competitive, capitalist economy. It is not that that the society cannot innovate qualitatively new methods. It's just that it cannot innovate economically, since it is unclear at the micro level how to compare the use of unlike goods to determine if new methods of production, producing similar goods, is better than another method. Central calculation problems become the topic of debate, which mainly where the most mainly where the most efficient methods of production are largely to be determined. To attempt to optimize a method to the relatively static existing economy could be feasible in theory, but the economic implications of a new key methodological change in production is difficult to model. This is because of its impact cannot be simply calculated in relation to the rest of the economic structure and must be tested so as to apply them where it is most socially and economically optimal. This cannot be planned, but can only be determined through scientific hypothesis and guess and test method, though there are likely more subjective factors which need to be incorporated. I would argue that the neoliberal period, where the state-directed economies reach their limit of catch-up development and where they are forced by necessity to introduce more market-compatible economic policies or degenerate further into failure. This is not the end of the pursuit of socialist horizons. The potential for greater dominance of the nationalized domain, using already relatively efficient monopolistic methods of production, shrinks the domain of the market. Also, the potential for growing power of the global proletariat remains unrealized in terms of its potential for political coordination and common ends. So, yeah. The war economy. I would like in the in-kind planning method, which rejected value metrics for concrete quantities of goods, advocated by Neurath and Barone early in the 20th century, is the most useful for total mobilization in times of social crisis. That is, it is mostly useful in the war economy, where rationing and total social mobilization is necessary, since meeting a finite number of concrete targets is absolutely essential for society to maintain itself. This is the case in the Leninist context, among others, in what is called war communism. In a certain way, this kind of crisis theory was anticipated by the anarchist theorist Kropotkin. He emphasized an increase in the tendency towards social cooperation to meet common needs in the time of crisis. If we examine the history of crisis in terms of social policy emerging in their aftermath, we can see that these crises disturb the internal social role allocation method into more hierarchical microcultural conventions like gender, caste, and race, and make more rational use of human resources within the system. Most of the civil rights legislation we know comes in the aftermath of these crises, where people have already had the experience of performing roles outside of a convention and are then asked by conservatives to return to their prescribed roles. Think of Rosie the Riveter doing industrial production in the war economy and how this leads to popular change of consciousness about the potential economic roles of women, which transcend this context. Neurath correctly imagined the total mobilization in a crisis creates positive infrastructural after effects, which serve the broader public, and prioritizes popular needs due to the more totalized planning environment. I should say that none of these theorists, nor I, would advocate a crisis or war as a means to achieve a more expansive system of social cooperation and social equality. These analyses are more descriptive than prescriptive. They are descriptively correct, but despite their serious limitations. Certain forms of regression are predictable in their aftermath. However, as I mentioned previously, in-kind or even calculated economic planning using concrete quantities of goods and given methods cannot determine what to do with the waste products of surplus in a socially optimal manner. Not only does this have negative effects on the welfare in terms of consumption goods, but also relates to the environmental impact of waste, which are not properly dealt with, since there is no way to assess the value of lost opportunities of this sort of target in advance. This is why societies drop this sort of method of central planning after the war, even if it's done gradually. This was also the case in the Soviet Union in its transition from war communism to the New Economic Program, NEP, which allowed for more autonomy of peasants to act in an entrepreneurial manner and enrich themselves through the use of their own agency to make production more efficient. Unlike many anti-communist liberals, I don't think that this experience spells the end to economic planning. However, the attempt to abandon the abstraction of economic value in planning, at least in all historical contexts observed so far, would necessarily have a regressive effect on the system beyond the emergency. This is because new needs and methods of production cannot be adequately evaluated or incorporated into this form of planning system, since those directing it cannot possibly account for them all. In my paper, I argue that theorists who employ war communist models, like the socialists Neurath and Barone, share a theory validated empirically to some degree, that people tend to come together in a crisis and rationalize their work towards common end. Neurath was of the opinion that social rationalization that came from the wartime conditions could be an impetus to create more egalitarian conditions on the basis of a society being more organized for common need. And it's not that he wanted war, but he saw the social mechanism to generate an economy that was more based on direct provision for need and less on profit motives, since it is true that the crisis conditions do create more egalitarian structures of distribution, since the demand for labor is greater. We can see many Keynesian social institutions coming out of crises. However, these are an impetus for reaction of these structures at the end of the crisis. After the crisis, the subject of the expanded economy only have the increased surplus production potential, which is unleashed by the greater economic rationalization, to have a point of leverage to maintain their gains. Since to the developmental state, the utility of this approach depends on expanding efficient modes based on the breadth of the production application, not their depth, altering the method itself. These gains do really exist, even if they come at great cost, but do not change the dynamics of the mode of production in a larger way, so as to create a structure which could maintain this form of economic organization. The narrow directives based on common concrete need of the system also reduces the capacity of the system to serve higher needs or to really take advantage of most resources efficiently. Using the provisioning in natura calculation, you cannot determine if new uses of existing resources could be applied more efficiently to meet needs and desires. You can only meet prescribed targets. This structure cannot achieve what labor coordination achieves. Certainly in the crisis, a corporate structure of labor coordination, due to its greater leverage over society, gains a higher standard of living. However, after the crisis, only changes in production relations that are desirable will be maintained. Like the coordination of labor forces to ultimately leverage the bargaining power over society as a unit is not feasible in the crisis, nor after it, since at that point, the leverage is lost. The knowledge of potential for more efficient labor organization could be gained from the crisis, but this will not likely be mobilized to a great extent. Like other systems I will refer to in this talk, this mode and political understanding is mainly contextually applicable and is not of use as a general mode of social organization. I would argue that it's greater value. It is of greater value than other understandings of later theorists. It is not a model of egalitarian prosperity, but only egalitarian austerity. I was quite attracted to it when I first read about it, but I think it speaks to my psychological situatedness in the neoliberal moment of more atomized personal despair, which emphasizes a catastrophizing outlook. The developmental state economy. Since the early 20th century, Utopian theorists were theorizing at a time when the socialist states were arising, and the needs of this context spoke to these theories to a large degree. I will argue, whether socialist or not, the trajectory of building up productive manufacturing economy and getting away from an economy that is based only on natural resource extraction is a social goal which has a strong influence in the structures in a way that they are theorized. Similar to the war economy, the focus on domestic production of economic innovation is suppressed, even as qualitative scientific innovation receives heavy investment. Just a moment.
Maybe I ask Adam, do you think we could we would finish in about 5-10 minutes? Is that good for you?
I'm afraid I have quite a bit more. Maybe I can try to be, I can summarize if I can. I suppose I haven't gotten to my main points. Maybe could you give me 20?
Yes.
Anyway,
I mean,
yes. All right, I'll do my best.
yeah, but if you want to summarize a bit, I think.
Sure, I'll try to skip through.
Good,
Although the issues of the war economy and the developmental state both have involve heavy planning and state market intervention, this is reduced in this form and is modified in the developmental state project. The goal is to build up a productive base, and this means a lower degree of spending on imports due to a protectionist policy. In contrast to the war economy, where particular concrete outputs are required in large quantities, the developmental state is focusing on importing methods of production and investing in the means of production. This is a strategy to build up a strategic domestic manufacturing industry to increase social surplus, to the eventual point that they can get more revenue from specialized goods on the international market. However, an ideological reifying process has caused many theorists to turn tactics into virtue, where a relatively closed, autarkic administrative economy is somehow better outside this context than the capitalist vision of free market and privatized means of production. The system of in the system, the idea of a matrix calculation and strategic administrative allocation remains central. The methods of production are imported from the outside for domestic development to attempt to jump past the experimentation which could be developed by small domestic capitalists to make products that are more fine-tuned to the context so as to build up the productive forces. Monopolistic methods are imported and administratively applied where they can be. The matrix could use prices of labor, but in-kind quantities are less useful outside the war context. Although they critique it, I think that the cockshot and Cottrell towards the new socialism is stuck in this nostalgia of the autarky of this mode, stemming from the Stalinist moment. They do attempt to constructively critique many elements of it, but they don't get beyond its structural flaws. Okay. I will now describe, I'll skip a bit here. I will now describe the dynamics of catch-up development state, and the demographic crisis of pauperization, of which it attempts to organize around. And this is also key for the neoliberal moment, globally, not just locally. Within a developing state economy, the economic innovations in the countryside, in the agrarian countryside, lead to capitalist consolidation and shedding of a large portion of the workforce, who flee to the cities in search of a living. The capital consolidation occurs because innovations can increase the area of efficient production of each enterprise, as well as cut down on necessary labor required to farm it. The cities may have wage labor available to scale and proximity efficiencies in manufacturing, but they lack the speed of industrial expansion, infrastructural expansion to keep up with the flood of new potential labor. This results in large pauperized shanty towns in the edges of the cities of industrializing societies. We can all recognize the images of the outskirts of cities in the developing countries, but we can also be reminded of Engels' description of the working classes of Britain were no different. In the way that this is generally managed in both Polanyi's description of the crisis in Britain in the Great Transformation, as well as how the demographic crisis is managed in China and the Soviet Union, is to put restrictions on migration to the city, as illiberal as this is, and simultaneously build up alternative urban centers and in an attempt to hold back this pauperization crisis. The collective farm is also a useful stopgap measure to hold back the population in the countryside beyond the point that they're a useful form of economic organization. This is because the expansion of infrastructure in the urban core is limited at its edges to a certain degree. And in a sense, the infrastructural construction can only expand at a certain rate, as it would become connected to and accessible to the core structures like water, electricity, sewage, roads, transit services, and therefore smaller alternative centers can be an outlet for labor capacity. They lack scale efficiencies, which the urban center cannot yet effectively accommodate. The neoliberal or global developmental state. The neoliberal redistribution of infrastructural investment from the first to the third world mirrors the developmental state economy now on a global scale. It emphasizes labor movement restrictions between countries rather than within them. There is a good deal of strategically planned international development to build up less developed economies in peripheral areas to try to prevent overheating of the core economies where wages are higher. The left or right might advocate or emphasize different elements of this process, generating different moral narratives around the same political economic process, but they don't seem to approach the agenda differently on balance. Avoiding this problem generates large shanty towns, which are not preferable for capital property holders, those with humanitarian concerns, or urban workers. I personally believe in the free movement of labor without restriction, but this is not what is produced by these economic structures. The anti-popularization project expanded internationally, manifests as a ramp up of investment in peripheral areas paired with austerity in the core. With the core working class absent from the bargaining table. The developmental state is trying to gain greater GDP through export-led production, depending on a copyright system. To do this, collaborates with globalized firms headquartered in their countries. This bolsters the value achieved through the export-led industrialization process developed in the industrialized economy as a protectionist measure. Really, this isn't any different from the developmental state in its mature form, just with the aim of local industrial development, which can benefit the wages, just without the aim of local industrial development, which can benefit the wages of the domestic working class. The neoliberal moment seems to come to a point of exhaustion of state planning and catch-up development in this particular way. It also has another effect more internal to the core productive system, politically and socially, which primarily impacts consciousness. This is primarily the issue which I think the neoliberal utopian models move in a regressive direction at the same time that it might be in line with global progress. And this is the same with a lot of degrowth critiques, which I don't get into too much detail here, but you can ask me about later. This is due to the political impact of the drawdown of industrial potential in the core, which is rational and progressive in relation to the global system. But domestically, it represents a regression both economically and politically, since it serves to reduce the livelihoods of the majority and thereby their political power. Universalizing these regressive elements into the utopian future will help nothing, but maintain the ideological function of legitimating the present. There is a political dynamic here that represents both an international increase of living standards of the underdeveloped areas and the decline of the living standards of the developed ones. Like Proudhon's limitation, in an attempt to save the artisanal subject in capitalism and thereby distorting this future possibility, so these theorists do this with this form of representation through reified categories. In this time period, the labor struggle is in decline due to the loss of bargaining power in the core economies, and so it raises up niche markets for the upwardly mobile middle classes, and their political visions of these middle classes become more prominent. This could be contrasted to the more generic mass consumption items more prominent in the war and post-war period. Okay, we can contrast the NGO structures and voluntary small groups that become prominent in this period to a labor union. The institutional leader of a labor union can be disciplined by those who claim to speak through the democratic process, through the leverage that the rank and file members exert collectively in their capacity to obstruct the labor process. Not only as dues paying members, but because they can strike independently. In the NGO, no formal accountability to those that speak on behalf of exists, but they rely on signals of community authenticity or community proxies, which are sources of legitimacy, sold manually to donors outside the interest group. And through it might be an appeal to those inside the group as well to legitimate their interests, even if they have no input in this process. So these three forms have application to the consciousness of a lot of the utopian applications that I was discussing. So at the point of me raising these issues of nominalism in socialist models like Adaman and Devines, as well as Albert and Hanels, is in the context of the proposed project, that all those who could be impacted by a particular project should have the right to steer its implementation. Morally, this sounds like a good system, but practically, this leaves us with much more questions than it answers. How do we apportion representation as well as legitimate it? How do we apportion degree of impact in the sense that it might weigh on the degree of decision making to those impacted by the project? To do this in a meaningful way, which would not overreach in terms of claims, would require a court system rather than a planning meeting, since the claim and the degree of impact should not just be incorporated into it because it is asserted. Authors, often movement activists themselves, assume activists who are passionate about issues will always have the most progressive intentions, since they imagine themselves in the role of activist legislators representing issues they are passionate about. However, regressive politics, as we should know by now, also inspire passionate advocates. The crisis of the present motivates both nostalgia and expansion of greater freedom. If we decide merely based on passion alone, there's no sense that legislation will be shaped to the popular interest at all, but will be based on the balance of forces of those who decide to show up. If we attempt to balance this perspective nominally, we assume potentially much more parity than actually exists. Think of the discourse around scientists in the media who acknowledge, contrast to those who accept the thesis of climate change. Representing the minority viewpoint here is actually a disservice to the vast majority. The greater diversity of meetings available to plan society, the less time and energy each person will have to engage in them. Motivation will decline with the number. Either way, legislation is surrendered to the conflicts between those who are most passionate, and any semblance of popular democracy is abandoned. I suppose this is the conflict between the electorate and the courts in determining policy. A flaw in the neoliberal cultural approach is that its primary emphasis, addressing alienation through greater modes of social participation, mass imperatives which drive this sentiment, the greater and greater social exclusion and marginalization of people from central economic institutions, be they central planning governments or corporatist Fordist forms, attempt to reintegrate meaning for these groups in crisis. The state of increased alienation due to the proliferation of joblessness among the population leads to an increased emphasis on psychological and emotional remedies among theorists who encourage social inclusion as a substitute for economic empowerment, such as small-scale projects like community gardens or community building activities like those that are emphasized by Diane Ellison. These end up being just a stopgap to deal with alienation and nothing more. They don't solve the problem. Initially, I had been enticed to study the subject itself because I really liked the Paracon system, and I thought it needed a calculation to make it viable. I ended up finding this to be the weakest of all proposed systems. Even its strongest element of balanced job complexes, a project which attempts to develop skills of personnel, already exists in the government and large companies. Paracon correctly identifies the emergent efficiency from what is strategic in employee development in government and monopoly capital. Like Proudhon does, he attempts to ascribe it in principle outside of its context, blinding us to the purpose it serves and those that deploy it in the first place. The emergence of the social phenomena, which is most similar to the balanced job complex, is due to the condition that there being a larger possibility for internal mobility due to firm size and the advantage of institutions to retain skill and tacit knowledge through employment. The distaste with bosses and the desire to be free of this kind of centralized discipline that they also advocate mirrors the anti-monopolistic individualism of the neoliberal period, breaking away from wartime conformity and anti-authoritarian anarchism and lifestyles. However, the movement against centralized disciplinary mechanisms has not been positive on the whole, stemming from this tendency. The worst element of Paracon is the idea of compensation based on approval of your coworkers, which seems to have been to presage Uberification of work in general. There are positive elements to this, but at the same time, those who advocate the model actually find it dystopic. This requires constant games to be played by individuals to convince others of their social value and worthiness. The diffusion of power, thought to be a liberation from a singular oppressive boss lording over you, when we actually experience it, is more of a total form of alienation, and even between equals, and a more impenetrable social discipline, which is immune from appeal or remediation. Rather, like Proudhon, it attempts to import the dynamic of the artisan, who's only disciplined by autonomous market, to the internal dynamics of the workplace. Another flaw in Paracon, is the sense that everyone can participate in the approval of a budget, an economic plan, insofar as they may be impacted by it. This is a much poorer political version of the Warasian cantonment, which is an attempt to describe the equilibrium price formed under capitalism, except in a more with a more individualistic consciousness, which could not possibly function in reality due to generalized ignorance about the detailed requirements of each process or the individual needs. If I was presented with an altered plan for, the enactment of a nuclear plant, I would have no way of assessing that other than to just defer to the experts who are already deciding on it. I would have no sense of if what they asked for as an advance of their budget or retraction of it was meaningful at all. It could not function in this way. Like Proudhon, his future-looking utopian ideas seem to be a poor reflection of a descriptive economic model using processes already in motion as described by Ricardo. I have similar thoughts on the economic structuring of ideology into the economy regarding degrowth politics, as well as certain contemporary gender politics, but I lack the space to discuss this at this moment. Please feel free to ask me. In conclusion, this presentation, rather than opening up possibilities, I have questions our own subjectivities, as situated in the dynamics of our day. In the struggle to see beyond our current situation, based on the values we internalize from our current moment, we merely reproduce our own society in the mirror darkly. I think we need to emphasize the realpolitik dynamics which produce the future we are looking for, and what can generate this impulse based on people's real self-interest, rather than as law or morally conservative rule imposed from on high. Rather than coming up with a governance structure of how we should act and assuming that we can get voluntary popular support, we should think about what kinds of social dynamics incentivize the outcomes we would prefer. I'm not sure what to advise for utopian models. It is difficult for me to anticipate the needs of the new economy. We will need to adapt to most centrally in their moment. These needs structure the desirability of the approach, not abstract moral sentiment. We can anticipate the character of the we can try to anticipate the character of the next conjuncture, but we can't really anticipate. We can anticipate emerging crises, but we often emphasize one factor as superior to all others in development of solutions. This tends to act as a barrier to developing the most optimal and relevant forms to address the crisis as it emerges. I don't think we can come up with a universal prescription to apply to all contexts, and we also might often be out-innovated by cooperative projects in existing society. The only advice I have is to more deeply interrogate how our utopian programs are structured by our moment. We need to really think through the real impacts of what we advocate in a less idealized form. And if we imagine this to be a serious exercise and not the realm of pure dreams situated in our time, we need to see how our idealized forms reflect the economy and economic movements of the present. Thank you for your time and interest and attention. I apologize for going long.